So today, as you can see, we get to start a brand new series that I'm putting together called King David from Shepherd to King. And so I think this will be an interesting series. I think it can be a little bit of fun for us. This series came about, I mentioned it last week, but it came about because last year when I asked you guys, I passed out these cards with the You Asked For It series where you could fill out cards on topics you wanted to hear about, and we did the You Asked For It series. One of those cards, and I've still got it, said this: a King David series similar to the Abraham series. So, we did an Abraham series a couple of years ago, and so here comes the David series. And you might notice the picture there. It's not off of the internet or anything. It's of this little guy right here, King David, that Sawyer put together, I guess, and snuck up here and put up here last week, I reckon. And so, King David, from shepherd to king. So after finishing the You Asked For It series, which was a little longer than I wanted it to be, but you guys had so many topics, and so I wanted to honor that. And then finishing our Above and Beyond series that took us through Easter, we're finally going to jump into this one that has been in the makings for a while. And so we're going to start off week 1 by looking at David and how he became the chosen one. David is known and has always been known as throughout history as the greatest king in the history of Israel. And so, in a way, every king that came after David would be compared to him. And as we're going to see in this series, it's about 10 weeks long right now, unless I add a week or take one out. As we are going to see in this series, even though David is known as a man after God's own heart, he still had faults. He still had sin in his life, like us. But this is what I really want us to get out of this entire series. We have to be ready when God calls us. We don't know how God will call us, where he may call us to, or what he may call us to do. But no matter what, we have to be ready when God calls us. There was a movie that came out in 2014 called Unbroken. Many of you probably watched it, about a man named Louis Zamperini. He was a young man who was a track star and made it to the Olympics, but he was commissioned to the United States Air Force as a lieutenant. And he served as a bombardier on B-24 Liberators in the Pacific during World War II. And on a search and rescue mission, his plane, if I remember correctly, had some mechanical failures, whatever, but it crashed into the ocean with him and 2 other men. One of them, they all 3 survived on a raft. One of them died days later. The 2 survived, though, Zamperini and one of the other ones. And they drifted at sea for 47 days. They were finally captured by the Japanese. He was taken to a total of 4 different prison camps, prisoner of war camps in Japan, where he was tortured. He was beaten by Japanese military personnel, basically because of his status as a famous Olympic runner. He was later taken to a new prison camp at a coal factory, and after a lot of hardship, finally released at the end of the war. But while he was on the raft, during those 47 days, without water, really barely surviving, things were tough. He prayed to God that if God would spare his life, he told God, I'll serve you for the rest of my life. Well, God spared his life. He was able to return home to the United States. But the promise that he had made to God on that raft was nowhere in his mind when he returned to the States. He was struggling with PTSD. He began to drink alcohol heavily as he had nightmares about his captors and how they beat him. It had gotten so bad that his wife wanted to divorce him. His wife had become a Christian. She had gone to a Billy Graham crusade, and after a lot of encouragement, they talked Zamperini into going to one of the crusades. And so reluctantly, he went. But Graham's teaching and his preaching reminded him of his prayers and his promise that he had made during his time on the raft, and then during his time when he was in prison. And so he committed his life to Christ. Following this, he ended up forgiving his captors, even went out to meet them. And all those who beat him, his nightmares that he had stopped. Zamperini went on for the rest of his life to serve Christ, just as he told God and Christ that he would do if he was spared. He had actually been pronounced dead during the war, killed in action. They say it wasn't until after the war, really, that they found out that he was alive, his family. He died of pneumonia on July 2nd of 2014 at his home in LA at 97 years old. And I say all that about him because when the time came, Zamperini was ready. And I don't know all the things that took place in his life from the time that he made that promise to God until he started to fulfill that promise, but we do know that he was ready when God called him to do his work. From the depths of despair where he was, with a life in ruins, knowing that he had nowhere else to turn, nowhere, he turned to the one who delivered him. And when I say the one who delivered him, I'm not talking about how God delivered him from being a prisoner of war, but how God had delivered him from being in the bondage of sin. And God still works that way today. And so what we're going to see in this David series, beginning in week 1, is that David had to be ready. He had to be ready when God called him. And we're going to see today that David's life was not in despair. He was not in ruins. It was nothing like the Zamperini story, but he had to be ready when the time came. Now, one of the first things that you'll notice, and that we can notice when we begin to look at David, when he first comes on the scene, and it's the same for us, is that we have to let God choose. I remember as a child in gym class, or whether you were outside and just playing games with your kids, you would have a captain, the person who would pick the teams. And so they chose teams, and you had to sit there and wait until they chose you, unless you were one of the first ones picked. Sometimes, for the people that were playing, that was the worst feeling of the entire day. They sat there while others were getting picked. And what hurt was that you had to wait on them to choose you while everybody else was getting chosen first. It's not a feeling we like to have. And I think sometimes as Christians we even have that feeling. And I think sometimes we even begin to wonder, why can't I hear God choosing? We want to know where God is when we need him. And so when we don't feel God's presence, or we don't understand that God is always working through us, we often decide to just go out and try to do it on our own, don't we? You see, a lot of people in our world are more concerned with impressing some other people than they are with pleasing God. And then what can happen when we live like that is we start to rely on what people want us to do instead of what God wants us to do. And God is actually choosing us, all of us, to do something special. So when we choose to do what our peers or what people want us to do, it really means that we're listening to the choices of man over the choices of God. Now, when we are able, and it's difficult, but when we're able to wait and listen for what God is choosing for us to do, then God's going to open that door. He's going to open a door for us to get it done. May not be easy, but he's going to open it. And a person who's waiting on God's choice, they don't try to just open all these doors on their own. They're instead content with waiting on God and only going through the door that God opens for them. And it's hard to do. It is. Now I'm going to read the first 6 verses right now of 1 Samuel chapter 16. And so at this point in time, for the nation of Israel, Saul is their king. He was the first king over the nation of Israel. But Saul had gotten to the point where he was not really following God's commands. He was not carrying out what God wanted him to do. And so at the end of the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter ends by actually telling us that the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And the 16th chapter begins this way in the first 6 verses. The Lord said to Samuel, How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me," go to the next slide. "You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." Now, when it comes to letting God choose, we can see here in these verses just how difficult that can be, even for Samuel, who was a prophet of God. And so what's taking place here in these verses is this: God has become so upset with Saul as the king and what. So God sends Samuel the prophet to Bethlehem to anoint this new king. And he sends him to the house of Jesse, who is the father of David. So Samuel goes to Bethlehem. He comes to this house of David. And notice what that last verse says. "And when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, 'Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord.'" You see, even for a prophet, even for a man of God, it can be difficult to wait and let God choose. So even if you and I make that mistake by trying to move too fast and not let God choose, understand that it happens to the best of them. But what Samuel has to learn here, real quick, is that he has to let God choose and not himself. And this was a big decision that Samuel was trying to make here. He's ready to anoint Eliab, the next king of Israel. So God has to show even Samuel, the prophet, that he needs to see as God sees. Now here's the problem with what Samuel was doing. He looks at Eliab, one of David's brothers, and assumes that he's the one. Maybe it's the fact that he's the oldest brother. Maybe it's the fact that he just looks the part of the next king. Saul, after all, the first king, was a man who was tall and handsome. But notice what verse 7 tells us. "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him.' The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." I don't know about you, but when I read that, it tells me that God had to put a stop to Samuel's thoughts immediately. And Samuel's thoughts, they were not evil. There were no bad intentions here that he was doing. He just wasn't letting God choose at first. He wasn't seeing as God sees here. And this verse right here, it's a great reminder that God sees things in others that we often just don't see. We overlook it. Now, I know I'm saying that we need to see as God sees, and in reality, in our simple human minds, with our simple human intelligence, we can't understand and we can't see everything exactly how God sees it. But if we slow down, and we wait and let God choose, then we at least have a chance to see something God sees. God makes it clear here to Samuel that you can't just look at the appearance of someone and make decisions about it. I'd even go so far as to say that you can't just listen to how some people speak and how smooth their words are, because we can be deceived by that. But notice what then happens in the next few verses. In verses 8 through 10 it says, "Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, 'The Lord has not chosen this one either.' Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, 'Nor has the Lord chosen this one.' Jesse had 7 of his sons pass said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. Here Jesse's bringing out his sons. This is a proud moment, I'm sure, for Jesse. He's told that one of his sons is going to be the next king. So he's bringing them out. He's anticipating it's going to be one of these. He brings them out one by one, from the oldest, I'm assuming, down to the youngest. 7 sons he brings out before Samuel. And each time Samuel looks at Jesse and he says, the Lord has not chosen us. And Samuel was able to finally do that at this point because he was now beginning to see as God sees. He went from trying to anoint the one he thought he should choose to looking for the one God was choosing. But notice what happens in the next verse. In verse 11 it says this. So he asked Jesse, talking about Samuel, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. It's pretty interesting to me that when Samuel invites Jesse and his family to this event right here where the next king is going to be anointed, Jesse brings out all of his sons except for one, David. Apparently Jesse was so sure that there was no way that his youngest son David would be the one chosen by God. So he didn't even think to bring him, although all the others were there. So at this time, what we see David doing right now is being faithful in his work. While Jesse is parading all of his other sons out there in front of Samuel, hoping that Samuel chooses one of those sons to be the next king, David is just out with the sheep. And I think it's something that can easily be missed, but let's look at this for just a brief minute. Here's David, this simple shepherd, doing a job that servants did, or the youngest in the family like David here. It's the type of job that most people just didn't want to do. In society, it was the type of job that some people, or many people, just looked down on. And we're going to notice as we go through the story of David in the coming weeks that his brothers even look down on him for who he is and what he does as well. And I don't know if David knew at this time that Samuel was even there to anoint one of them as king. I don't know. But there's this simple principle here that you can see kind of throughout Scriptures. That's this. When God is looking for someone to do something special, in a lot of cases, He's looking for someone who is faithful in what they are already doing. It helps us to be faithful in life. See, if I can be faithful in what I'm doing for work, and if you can be faithful in what you're doing for work, then there's a good chance we can be faithful in what God is calling us to do. So whatever your work is in life, be faithful in it. Now in this story with David, Samuel finally asked Jesse if these are all the sons he has. Of course, Jesse answers and says they're still the youngest, but he's out tending the sheep, kind of like, but he's out tending the sheep. There's no way it could be him. To which Samuel replies, well, send for him. We're not going to sit down until he gets here. And then the 12th verse says this. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one, the chosen. Now, at first glance, it appears that you can have a double standard here in this story. When you think back to the first son that came before Samuel, God said, don't look at his appearance. But what do we read here when David shows up? We read that, David is a fine appearance. He's handsome. And God says, rise and anoint him. That's the one. But here's the thing. God did not choose David because of his appearance. He didn't choose him because of how he looked. Do you remember back in verse 7 when he said that about Eliab, that God doesn't look at the appearance? It goes on to say that God looks at the heart. Even though David was handsome, even though he looked the part physically, his heart was what caught God's attention. And I think one of the things that shows the heart of David is the fact that he faithful in his work. It's a simple shepherd. So there you have it. David becomes king. From shepherd to king. Because remember this, it's in God's time. So not so fast. At this moment, Samuel takes that horn of oil. He anoints David right there in front of all of his brothers and his dad. We read the Spirit of the Lord came upon David mightily from that day on. Samuel gets up and leaves, but David would have to do something here. It's one of the most difficult things for us to do in life. He had to wait. It's hard. He had to wait until it was on God's timetable for him to become king and sit on the actual throne. Just imagine how difficult that can be sometimes. Because it's hard for us to wait. Especially in this situation. You know something good is going to happen. He knows it. He's already anointed king. And then, like us, you get all this enthusiasm. Then you have to wait. And you had no idea how long you have to wait. He was in the same shoes for you. Or sandals, I guess, at that time. He had no idea how long he was going to have to wait. That's something we can struggle with. We can begin to ask the question, why hasn't it already happened? And I think it's at this point where humility has to begin to set in for us. I understand that God's in control, that He's working. He's working out His plan in His way. But it still leaves us feeling uneasy. Because it's our human nature now to just want to know. We want to know what's going on. We want to know when it's going to happen. So with that being said, one thing we're going to notice in this story of David as we go through it in the coming weeks is that he doesn't stop working. He doesn't stop being faithful. And why? Because he understood that this was in God's time. Even though David is so excited, he had to be thrilled this time. I mean, I can't even imagine this shepherd. He's just out there feeding sheep, watching over them. And minutes later, he's anointed as the next king over God's people, Israel. Now all he has to do is remain faithful and wait for God's time. Now next week, we're going to look at one of the great examples of how faithful David was and how great his faith was in God. One of the most difficult things for us to do, one of the most important things for us to try to learn to do, is to keep striving to advance His kingdom. That certainly applies to the times when we have to wait. God could have made David king immediately. Obviously could have done that if He wanted to. But pay attention here in the next couple of weeks to what David's going to have to go through before he gets to sit on that throne while he waits. Because it can make some of our waiting and what we go through seem so chosen. God chose David to be the future king of Israel. To make that happen, the prophet Samuel needed to step back, let God choose, and see as God sees. And when we can do that, when we are able to wait and be faithful in what we do, God's going to work out His plan in His time. The exciting news for us today is this. God's still choosing people to do His work, including us. So be ready when He calls. I want to thank you for joining us for our first week of this David series. I think it's going to be an interesting one. We'll find out. But the story of David is an interesting story. It's got a lot of things that take place within it. And so we're going to be covering a lot of things here in the next couple of months, looking at the life of David, and there's a lot of lessons, different lessons for us to learn. The first one right here is that we got to be ready, and sometimes that means we have to wait, and that's hard for us to do. But we have to step back, let God choose, and try to see as God sees. Now I want to thank you for joining us. If you've never made the decision to become a follower of Jesus Christ, you always have that opportunity to do so. And we're going to stop. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation here this morning. Our hymn of invitation this morning is going to be song number 214, Lord, I'm Coming Home. We're going to sing the first and the last verses, standing as you are here.